Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully you all are having a wonderful day today. So anyways, I thought that I would review this little video because I found this very, very interesting. And this is going to kind of cover the same topic along the lines of the Tyson Fury Deontay Wilder trilogy. However, the reason why I wanted to review this video is because I kind of know what I kind of wanted to talk about. And I already kind of talked about it in my opinion. Where do I personally think Tyson Fury ranks in terms of the all-time greats? And in my opinion, Tyson Fury, I cannot necessarily put him, at least as of yet, I can't necessarily put him in that tier A or that tier 1 list of heavyweights that I have. And my tier 1 that I have when it comes to the all-time great heavyweights, I have 3 people in that conversation. I have Muhammad Ali in that conversation, I have Rocky Marciano in that conversation, and I have Lennox Lewis in that conversation. Now, some people also would put Joe Louis in that conversation. But in my opinion, Joe Louis, I'm not necessarily sure if his competition was as up to par as some of those other guys. And that's not me saying that he did not defeat great fighters for his day. But Joe Louis, he did lose some of the bigger fights a little bit later on during his career. Not me saying that he didn't win some of the bigger ones, but Joe Louis, in my opinion, he would be slightly below those other guys. Tyson Fury, in my opinion, when it comes to the all-time great heavyweights, I would probably have him at about number 6. He is a highly skilled heavyweight when it comes down to it. I would say all in all that, like I said, Lennox Lewis, Muhammad Ali, and Rocky Marciano, those would be the 3 greatest heavyweights of all time in my opinion. And you can really debate who you put at first place, second place, and third place. That's really up to you. But when it comes to the people that are just a little bit lower than that, I think that you have people like Tyson Fury. You can possibly debate someone like an Evander Holyfield or George Foreman. And I think Tyson Fury, I think that he is somewhere along those lines. Now, if Tyson Fury, if he also somehow were able to defeat Alexander Usyk and also defeat Anthony Joshua, who are the other 2 great heavyweights of this generation and would be the only heavyweights, the other great heavyweights that Tyson Fury has not yet defeated, if he were able to defeat those 2, in my opinion, Tyson Fury, he is going to have to be named up there in that tier 1 tier, at least I believe. I think Tyson Fury, I think all in all that he is an all-time great fighter. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. But today we're going to look at a video by Dante's Boxing Nation. And apparently Dante, he's going to be talking about how a certain amount of people, they all in all said that they did not think that it was the most technical fight on the planet. So it is what it is, or the most technical fight that they've seen. And I would agree to a certain degree. Deontay Wilder certainly has never really been that technical of a fighter. And even Tyson Fury at times can be a little bit sloppy. But I think that Tyson Fury is a very skilled fighter. He certainly is the most skilled heavyweight of this generation, at least probably of the past 10 plus years. In my opinion, he has excellent feet. He has excellent head movement. He's usually very defensively responsible. Now, in my personal opinion, I don't think that he put on the best performance in this fight, but that does not always necessarily mean that he's not a greatly skilled fighter. But a big part of the reason why these guys are now trying to make this narrative to where, well, Tyson Fury, all in all, he was never all around that skilled of a fighter. The reason why they're trying to promote this narrative is because they don't want Tyson Fury's name to be up there with the other all-time great heavyweights. They don't want him to surpass Muhammad Ali. They don't want him to surpass, especially a Joe Louis or someone else like that. But basically what I'm saying is this. They do not want a Caucasian heavyweight, especially one who is undefeated, to be along the same ranks as a Muhammad Ali or some of the other all-time great heavyweights. They don't want him there. And that's why Dante's Boxing Nation and some of these other channels, they're now changing their narratives and basically saying, well, Tyson Fury, yeah, he beat Deontay Wilder, but he never really defeated anyone that was that complete, and Tyson Fury really isn't overly skilled. All this sort of bullshit when it comes down to it. But let's see what Dante has to say. It should be very interesting.
If I was a regular fan, I probably would love it. But I was disappointed because I didn't see the art that I was short. And I asked Lennox Lewis, and he said, yeah. He said, Kyle, you heard him. He said, yeah, I didn't see that. So I can't, look at me. I had the World Heavyweight Championship twice. I could talk okay. There's a lot of boxers that can't talk. I had a good trainer. I put him like this. I put him like this. I put him like this. And it looks pretty. Art, The art of boxing look pretty. Step back like this, here, throw the punches, here, up there. You didn't see none of that. You didn't see this slip, bam, bam.
Well, I have to disagree. And basically what this gentleman is saying overall, and I'm not necessarily sure who this is. I would have to look it up. But when it comes down to the overall, when it came down to it all in all, I think that Tyson Fury, I think all in all that he is a very skilled fighter. And if you see him all in all in his most elite fights, I'm not going to necessarily say that I think he's as talented as, say, Muhammad Ali or anything like that, because Muhammad Ali was very talented. But Tyson Fury, all in all, he's extremely talented. Tyson Fury is a dude that, once again, he has very good footwork for his size. He has very good hand speed for his size. He has excellent conditioning. And on top of that, we have to give Tyson Fury this type of credit. He is undefeated. Like I said, you would not see a lot of people, calling Andre Ward and saying, well, you know what? Because he had those two tough fights with Sergey Kovalev, all in all, it's not pretty. And Andre Ward, he can never be compared to some of the other greats for that. You would never hear other boxers say that. At least not usually. Now, to a degree, I get what they're saying, because I'm not going to necessarily say that Tyson Fury, that he looks as pretty as Andre Ward overall when he boxes. But it's very clear that Tyson Fury, that he is a really, really good heavyweight, especially of this generation. Tyson Fury, when you talk about almost every other heavyweight, Tyson Fury is a dude that really stands out. So it is what it is.
Okay? And that's what I was looking for. The art of boxing looks pretty. Dante's Boxer Nation, what's going on, guys? Let me start by saying this. I told you guys many times before the fight, and I told you right after the fight in my post-fight video, that both fighters, Wilder and Tyson Fury, they have a lot to lose in this fight. Because if Wilder loses, that means even when Tyson Fury wasn't cheating, he still couldn't beat him. And if Tyson Fury loses, that means he could only...
Like I said, even after the third fight, these guys that allege that Tyson Fury cheated, they're never going to allege that he didn't cheat, because once again, why the hell would they? They stood on that hill for so long. They're never going to deny that, even if they truly believe that Tyson Fury did not cheat. They're going to stand on that hill forever. It is what it is.
Beat Deontay Wilder when he was cheating. There is no doubt about it that Tyson Fury is the better man over Deontay Wilder. But with that being said, we also know that Tyson Fury, he definitely beat the least skilled, especially American champion in boxing today. We already know that. I have always told you guys.
That's basically their way of trying to discredit Tyson Fury. Because now with Dante, he's trying to do damage control, and he says, well, I can't have this Caucasian fighter. I not only cannot have him ranked up with some of the other black fighters that I like, but when it comes down to it, I can't have Tyson Fury. I can't have him in the all-time great conversation, because that's not what we want. So we have to try to tear this guy down right now. That's basically what they're doing. Because if Tyson Fury, if he ends up retiring, and if he ends up undefeated, and especially if he beats the winner of the Alexander Usyk versus Anthony Joshua rematch, he's going to be looked at in that tier. Now, whether you agree with that or not is up to you. But when it comes down to it, Tyson Fury is going to be looked at or argued by some people as the greatest heavyweight of all time. And if Tyson Fury, if he remains undefeated, and if he defeats Alexander Usyk and also, in my opinion, Anthony Joshua, he'll have a claim to that. That's his business. He has a right to say that. That does not necessarily mean that I 100% agree that he would be the greatest heavyweight of all time. But when it comes down to it, if you're going to have Muhammad Ali in that conversation, if you're going to have Rocky Marciano and Lennox Lewis in that conversation, if Tyson Fury especially ends up undefeated, you're going to have him in that conversation. Because Tyson Fury, hands down, was the most complete heavyweight of his day. When it comes down to it, he was the most skilled heavyweight of his day, and he never lost. So Tyson Fury, when it comes down to it, he is debatably going to be in that conversation, and that's what these guys see. That's why they say, okay, we cannot have him that high. It's the same thing with Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes in football, I'm not saying that he's ever going to be counted over Tom Brady. I'm not even sure if he's ever going to make it to the Joe Montana or Peyton Manning level. Patrick Mahomes, he just might end up like another Drew Brees or Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson. But a lot of people, they're already trying to tear him down because they don't want a black quarterback to be remembered as potentially the greatest quarterback of all time. It's the same thing here. So It is what it is. That's why these guys, whenever it comes to Canelo or Vasily Lomachenko or Tyson Fury, even Alexander Usyk, they try to tear them down because they realize that they're a very big threat to the number one pound for pound spot, and they're also a very big threat in terms of history of arguing overall who the greater fighters were. So it is what it is.
That Deontay Wilder does not beat fighters with skill. He beats fighters with his will and that right hand that he has.
That's great, but you know what? There's been fighters in the past that don't necessarily beat fighters with skill. George Foreman was not a fighter all in all that necessarily beat fighters because he was the most skilled fighter on the planet. George Foreman even said out loud not too long ago that I had about one or two weapons, and if you got past that, I didn't really know what to do. But people count George Foreman as an all-time great heavyweight. So it is what it is. And in my opinion, he is. George Foreman, in my opinion, would be within my top 5, top 6 heavyweights of all time. George Foreman was a monster, no doubt about it. You know, he was around the second best of his generation, depending on if you count George Foreman over Joe Frazier or if you count Joe Frazier over him. I personally would count George Foreman over Joe Frazier, but that's up to you. When it comes down to the overall, you know, not every fighter needs to be a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or someone that's like a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker or, you know, someone overall with a super duper A-grade skill set, someone that is, you know, just has no faults whatsoever. Not every single one of those fighters have to be flawless to be all-time greats. Muhammad Ali was a person that was very flawed as well. That's why he had hell with Joe Frazier almost every single fight. He also had hell with a couple of other fighters in his career as well, like Ken Norton.
That's how he wins fights. That's his equalizer. And that's what made him so dangerous because you can outbox Deontay Wilder the whole night, but you got to do it without getting in touch with that right hand. And that was a hard...
Right, but no one can outbox Deontay Wilder the same way that Tyson Fury was able to. Because Tyson Fury is a 6'9", 270-pound dude that has an excellent jab, an excellent right hand, excellent head movement, very defensively responsible, and a dude that has very high boxing IQ. People try to act like Tyson Fury that he's just some ordinary bozo. Tyson Fury is an all-time great fighter.
Thing for a lot of fighters to do. And Tyson Fury, he knows that very well. He found that out in the first fight, and he definitely found that out in a third fight when he was fighting against a Deontay Wilder that was out on his feet, and he was still getting knocked down by Deontay Wilder. My point is...
This lie that Deontay Wilder was completely out on his feet or that he was completely done within the first couple rounds, all that is a bunch of horse shit. Once again, Deontay Wilder, the reason why he looks out on his feet is just because he has naturally bad feet. I've already told people this. You know, Deontay Wilder does not have good feet. He never has. It is what it is. That doesn't mean that you were out on your feet. That just means that you have very poor footwork. It is what it is. Deontay Wilder, he did not really start to run out of steam, at least completely, until about the 6th or 7th round.
He already knew Deontay Wilder was not known for...
But that's so funny that Dante's Boxing Nation and all these guys, they were predicting a Deontay Wilder knockout. We all heard them say that. And then now, once Tyson Fury whooped his ass once more, you know, all of a sudden, Tyson Fury, well, he should have got him out of there sooner. Why? Because I thought Tyson Fury couldn't punch. You know, all of a sudden, Tyson Fury can punch, and he should have got him out of there earlier. Well, it should be a major accomplishment for Tyson Fury that he knocked him out that late because apparently he's this Paulie Malignaggi, right?
Skill. He was the least skilled fighter, like I said, out of all of the American champions. Hands down, it's not even close. But he had that equalizer, which made...
I'm trying to think of all the American champions in the past. Once again, George Foreman. A lot of people really lionize George Foreman. But George Foreman was not an extremely skilled heavyweight. George Foreman was not as skilled as Floyd Patterson. George Foreman was not as skilled as Joe Frazier. George Foreman was not as skilled as some of the other American heavyweight champions that you've seen from the past. But you would count him almost over every single one of those fighters, wouldn't you? So, it's just so interesting. These guys, they had Deontay Wilder on their pound-for-pound list, which I always said that he never was. He was never a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. But right as soon as this dude loses, they have to literally discredit Tyson Fury so much because they don't want a Caucasian fighter to be remembered as one of the great heavyweights, if not possibly the greatest heavyweight of all time, because if he beats Alexander Usyk or Anthony Joshua, they're going to call him that, or at least there's going to be a real push of that. And let me tell you what, I don't have a problem with that. Some people, all in all, they're going to disagree. Once again, does that mean that I'm going to automatically have Tyson Fury as my #1 overall heavyweight? No. But we'll see what happens.
Made up for his flaws. See, guys, the thing is, normally, once again, when we're talking about the fighter that lacks skill, we're talking about Deontay Wilder. But as we've seen in this fight, and as you heard from Tim Witherspoon, and even from Lennox Lewis, neither one of these fighters really displayed the art or really any skill. The only difference is Tyson.
So Tyson Fury didn't display any skill, but he whooped Deontay Wilder's ass the way that he did. Okay.
Showed more skill than Deontay Wilder. The reason why Tim Witherspoon and Lennox Lewis and other people, by the way, even Teddy Atlas, who is a huge Tyson Fury fan, and he can't.
I'm not really sure if he's a big Tyson Fury fan or not, because actually he predicted Deontay Wilder to beat Tyson Fury every single time. I would think that if Teddy Atlas was a real big Tyson Fury fan, one would think overall that he would go with Tyson Fury in the third fight, but maybe I'm wrong.
Stand Deontay Wilder. After this fight, surprisingly, Teddy Atlas, he was really praising Deontay Wilder, and he really made it sound like it was more.
So he hates Deontay Wilder, but he was praising him after the fight. Okay.
Of Deontay Wilder's fight to lose as opposed to Tyson Fury just being the better man. You know, he didn't really explain it like it was a very impressive performance by Tyson Fury. There's no doubt about it. Tyson found a way to get the job done. But my point is, all of these people are criticizing Tyson Fury's performance because he was the guy with the skill. He was the guy that was supposed to be in there outboxing and looking flashy, etc., etc.
Well, I thought that he looked good. I just don't think that he looked great. But I've seen Tyson Fury perform much better in the past. When you take a look at his Vladimir Klitschko performance, he completely embarrassed him. Like, he literally outboxed him 9 rounds to 3. And he's going to make the Hall of Fame, no doubt about it. I believe that Deontay Wilder is going to make the Hall of Fame as well. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that he's a top 10 heavyweight of all time or anything. But when it comes down to it all in all, Tyson Fury, he beat 2 great fighters. And Deontay Wilder, when it comes down to it, he was a very, very dangerous opponent. Like I said, Deontay Wilder, he's the George Foreman of this generation. He can pretty much only fight in one way. When it comes down to it, he has excellent power. But if you're able to get past his first game plan, his plan A, he don't really have much for you. So that's why I call Deontay Wilder the George Foreman of this generation. Now, they're built a little bit differently. You know, they fought a little bit differently. But they also had somewhat of similar styles because they pretty much fought in one way. So it is what it is.
See none of that in this fight. And I think that's going to be a major problem for Tyson Fury going in the ring with anybody else. Fighters that are complete fighters. Fighters that, once again, they use all of their tools in the toolbox and not just the right hand. And a wild right hand at that, because that's the right hand. We didn't even see a nice right hand in this third fight from Deontay Wilder. Even his best punch looked.
He tried. He just overall, once again, he couldn't get it off because Tyson Fury, he was too slick for him. He was too good for him. I don't even think Tyson Fury had an A-grade performance for himself. I think that, personally, I'd give him about a B+. I didn't even think he had an A-grade performance. Now, after round 4, he pretty much had a very, very good performance. But this was not that good of a performance from Tyson Fury. Now, that performance that he had in the rematch against Deontay Wilder, that was an A+ performance.
Extremely wild. You know, there's a reason why we have a pound-for-pound list.
Now, look at this when it comes down to it. It says, if they were all naturally the same weight in the same weight class, who beats Tyson Fury? Who asks a question like that? Because if you know shit about boxing and if you don't have an agenda, why the hell would you ask a question like this? Because when it comes down to it, the heavyweights are going to fight differently. Did Dante ever ask the question with Deontay Wilder? Well, who would win if they were in the same weight class? Deontay Wilder or Terrence Crawford? Deontay Wilder or Shakur Stevenson? Like, why the hell would you even ask a question like this unless you obviously had a biased agenda? Like, come on, man. Like, even if we want to talk about other all-time great heavyweight fighters, you know, who would win if they were in the same weight class? Mike Tyson or Roy Jones Jr.? Probably Roy Jones, right? But does that mean overall that Mike Tyson is still not a very skilled fighter or a great fighter? Now, Mike Tyson, in my opinion, has been very overrated throughout the years because he pretty much lost every big fight in his career. But when it comes down to it, you understand what I'm saying? Like, why would you even ask that? Or if I say, well, you know what? Who would win if they were in the same weight class? Sugar Ray Robinson or Muhammad Ali? Now, some of you may say Muhammad Ali. There's also a lot of people overall that would say Sugar Ray Robinson. But does that mean that Muhammad Ali is not great in his own right? Like, come on, man. Or if I were to say, well, who would win if they were in the same weight class? Andre Ward or overall, Terrence Crawford. Now, maybe you think Andre Ward would win that fight because he was quite skilled. But when it comes down to it, let's just say you think either Earl Spence or Terrence Crawford would win that fight. Does that mean that Andre Ward is not a great fighter? Like, come on, man. It's so clear why Dante is trying to spread this bullshit. But it is what it is.
All the fighters in every division. It means all of these fighters are being compared to each other. Who is the best overall, right? So I put a poll together where I asked the question, if they were...
Yes, you asked a very stupid question. But it is what it is. Anyway.
All in the same weight class, right? All same natural weight. It could be in the welterweight division, the middleweight division, the heavyweight division, whatever. They're all the same weight. But let's just say maybe Tyson Fury, he still has a major height advantage over everyone else. So let's just say if it's welterweight, Tyson is 2 to 4 inches taller than everyone he faces. Like I said, in that scenario, I asked the question, who beats Tyson Fury? Terrence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez, Gervonta Tank Davis, Shakur Stevenson, or all of the above? And as you guys can see, with 17,000 votes, the majority of fans said all of the above. And by the way, I was going to...
That's great, but once again, let's try to compare Muhammad Ali to, let's compare him to the 80s. Let's compare him overall to the fighters overall. Like, would Muhammad Ali, would he beat Marvin Hagler in a fight if they were the same weight class? Now, maybe some of you think that he would. That's up to you. All right? Would he beat Sugar Ray Leonard if they were in the same weight class? Who the hell knows? Would he beat Tommy Hearns? Would he beat Roberto Duran? Do you see what I'm saying? You cannot compare heavyweights to any other weight class because heavyweights, they move differently. They're usually slower when it comes down to it. They don't usually have the same amount of pizzazz. I'm not saying that some heavyweights don't get me wrong. But when it comes down to it, heavyweights, they just aren't usually the same as smaller weight class fighters. That's why when you take a look at cruiserweights and heavyweights, no one ever says that Evander Holyfield or Mike Tyson were as skilled as Sugar Ray Leonard. Now, some people overall, they may say that Mike Tyson was once upon a time, but then when he got in his bigger fights, that was quickly exposed. It is what it is.
Include none of the...
Or Lennox Lewis even. Lennox Lewis was an extremely skilled heavyweight fighter. Would I put him on the same level as a Sugar Ray Leonard or a Marvin Hagler? Not necessarily. Now, some people overall may disagree. But take a look. Lennox Lewis, he got knocked out in a couple of his fights. It is what it is. And that was when, he was overall at the prime of his career. Not like when Sugar Ray Leonard got knocked out by Hector Macho Camacho when he was pretty much done.
But I couldn't because you can only put 5 options. But you see, it really doesn't matter because the majority of fans picked all of the above. Which means that Tyson Fury is the least skilled fighter out of all of the best boxers in the world. Now, once again, remember, before Deontay Wilder lost, we had already knew that he was the least skilled because he beat fighters with his power and his willpower. Now, of course, the results of this poll, it upset a lot of Tyson Fury fans. They immediately started to try to defend Tyson, saying, well, this is not a fair comparison. It's not a fair question.
No, it's not a fair question. It's not a fair comparison at all. And if you knew shit about boxing or knew shit about the sport, you would know that firsthand. Because there's no heavyweight. I'm going to tell you this right now. There was no heavyweight in the history to where if you take a look at it, they usually looked as good as a Sugar Ray Leonard or a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Sugar Ray Robinson. Muhammad Ali was up there, I suppose, if you want to say his talent, but pretty much any other heavyweight, they were not on that same level. They all had flaws when it came down to it that, they did not look like they were as skilled as the lighter weight fighters. That's why usually when you take a look at the pound for pound list throughout the years, it usually was not a heavyweight fighter. Now, here and there, Muhammad Ali might have been ranked the number 1 pound for pound fighter and maybe even at one point in time Mike Tyson. But even do it throughout the 80s, I believe it was usually either Sugar Ray Leonard, at one point in time Roberto Duran, at one point in time Marvin Hagler. When you take a look at the 2000s, when you take a look at the 2010s, what heavyweight fighter was ever ranked the number one pound for pound fighter? Nobody. It is what it is. It was either Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao, Andre Ward. There was never any heavyweight fighters that was ranked the number one pound for pound fighter. It is what it is. Heavyweight fighters throughout history, even usually, once again, they have not usually been ranked the number one pound for pound fighter, at least for a very, very long time. That's why even Sugar Ray Robinson, during his day, he was ranked the number one pound for pound fighter. So it is what it is.
Because Tyson Fury is a heavyweight and things are different when you're a heavyweight. But listen, we all know that if I would have put Mike Tyson in that poll, like I said, instead of using Tyson Fury, the Mike Tyson in his prime, and I put him up against all these other fighters asking who's the best fighter, I can guarantee you the results would be a lot more closer because...
Right, but why would you put Mike Tyson in the same poll when it comes to fighters like Gervonta Tank Davis? And even if you put George Foreman in there, people are going to recognize George Foreman's name, and they're going to immediately say, just because George Foreman is recognized as an all-time great heavyweight, they're going to say, oh, well, George Foreman, he's more skilled than those guys. But in all reality, he wouldn't be. You know what I'm saying? So skills are great, but that's why the most important thing in boxing, I don't care what anybody says, you cannot be ranked the number one pound for pound fighter just because of your skill set. You have to be ranked the number one overall pound for pound fighter mainly because of your resume. That's why I can't have people like Terrence Crawford, overall, or Naoya Inoue super high on my pound for pound list. I just can't have it. They look extremely skilled in certain areas, but who have they beat? You know what I'm saying? Tyson Fury has 2 dominant A-class wins. Like definitive A-class wins. There's no doubt about that. It is what it is.
Mike Tyson was one of the most skilled boxers in heavyweight history. In fact,
yes, also one of the most overrated. Lost every big fight in his career. That he got completely outboxed by James Buster Douglas. He got completely whooped by Evander Holyfield, and then he fought Lennox Lewis, and then he got his ass canned. So what does that say about Mike Tyson?
As aggressive as Mike Tyson was, it could be argued that he was the best defensive heavyweight, at least when he was in his prime.
Against bums. It's no offense against Mike Tyson, but, people, they always make excuses for this dude. They always say that Mike Tyson, he lost to the animal and sign all their bullshit. Well, that's great. You can argue that with a certain amount of other fighters. But does that mean overall that, that he should get a certain amount of excuses? Like Edwin Valario, he was another fighter overall that had a lot of problems. Are you going to hear any of these LDBC and new media channels say, oh man, Edwin Valario, he was one of the all-time great fighters. And all in all, had he continued fighting, he would have been one of the all-time greats. No, because they don't give a shit. They only do that with certain fighters that they like. It is what it is. But Dante, what you should ask is that Mike Tyson, was he as skilled as some of the other pound-for-pound boxers during that generation? Was he as skilled as a Sugar Ray Leonard or a Roberto Duran or a Tommy Hearns or a Marvin Hagler? And I guarantee you that you're at least going to get some people, at least people that know shit about boxing. Well, let me not hold my breath there, because people who subscribe to your channel probably don't know a whole lot about boxing. But it is what it is, because you don't know a whole lot about boxing either. But when it comes down to the overall, let's be real. Sugar Ray Leonard, all in all, was a greater fighter than Mike Tyson. He was more skilled than Mike Tyson. All right, when it came down to it, so was Marvin Hagler. So was Roberto Duran. So overall was Tommy Hearns, debatably. All those fighters you can compare with Mike Tyson in terms of skill set, because really, if we want to talk about Mike Tyson, and I think that Mike Tyson was a very great heavyweight to a degree, but when it comes down to it overall, what did he show in his big fights? Even had Deontay Wilder, let's say Deontay Wilder, he won the trilogy over Tyson Fury. Deontay Wilder would be over Mike Tyson on my list, because there's just no A-class wins that Mike Tyson has in his career. There's none. So it is what it is. George Foreman, he was not as skilled as Mike Tyson, but you have to rank George Foreman over Mike Tyson in terms of all-time great heavyweights. Why is that? Because he has bigger wins in his career. He just did more in his career.
Would seldomly ever hit Mike Tyson with flush shots. His defense was impeccable.
So what about James Buster Douglas? Did Tyson Fury ever lose to a type of fighter that James Buster Douglas was? A dude overall that was a 42-1 underdog? So, yeah, let's talk about Mike Tyson's skill set. Let's talk about how he looked in that James Buster Douglas fight. Let's talk about how he looked in both Evander Holyfield fights. Let's talk about how he looked against Lennox Lewis, even against Razor Ruddock. Mike Tyson, don't get me wrong, he was very skilled, but his skill set and his greatness has been majorly overrated. Majorly.
And then you have other heavyweights like Lennox Lewis, like Riddick Bowe, the Klitschko Bros. I mean, all of these fighters, we know if they were in any other divisions, they would still be a problem. They would still be extremely competitive with.
So, Tyson Fury beat the hell out of Vladimir Klitschko. I thought you said that Vladimir Klitschko was nothing but a jab and grabber. All of a sudden you're saying that that he would be a problem in any other division. I hate to tell you this, Dante. Let me educate you because you don't seem to know what the hell you're talking about. Tyson Fury is way more skilled than a Vladimir Klitschko ever was.
All the other best fighters in all of the different weight classes is the point. It's only Tyson Fury that fans feel is the least skilled, the least talented out of all of the current best fighters in the world today. Something else, you can't use he's 6'9", and, what makes him so unique at the heavyweight division is this and this. If that were the case, then Lennox Lewis and Tim Witherspoon wouldn't be talking about how they're disappointed because they seen no skill. I am telling you guys.
Well, let me tell you what. If Lennox Lewis or Tim Witherspoon ever fought Tyson Fury, they would have a hell of a time. And I don't care what heavyweight were to go up against Tyson Fury, whether it be Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano, Lennox Lewis, Vitaly Klitschko, Vladimir Klitschko, George Foreman. I don't care who it would have been. Tyson Fury would have gave anyone in the history of the heavyweight division a hell of a fight.
Guys, right now.
And he probably would have beat the majority of them.
After watching this version of Tyson Fury that we just seen, once again,
people always love to talk this shit, especially with the older fighters. They always love to say, well, Tyson Fury, he can compare to some of these other fighters. Really, like who? Do we think that every single one of those fighters would have beat Tyson Fury? Do you think that Muhammad Ali would have 100% for sure beat Tyson Fury? Now, maybe he would have. Who knows? But who the hell knows? Muhammad Ali had a few losses in his career. He lost to Joe Frazier. He lost to Ken Norton. He lost to a couple of other guys. It is what it is. All right? Now, some of those losses were when he was a bit older, but it is what it is. Even Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis had a hell of a time with Vitaly Klitschko, I believe, in that last fight. Vitaly was a decent fighter. He was not as skilled as Tyson Fury. It is what it is.
To take him 11 rounds.
And a lot of people, they also really love to talk shit about, Mike Tyson. Oh, if Mike Tyson were around today, he'd knock everybody out. Is that really the truth? Would he knock out Tyson Fury as quickly as many of you guys allege? Because let's be real, Mike Tyson, he did have great punching power. But what did he do in every big fight in his career? What did he do? He didn't do anything. He lost. In fact, he got canned every single time he stepped up in competition. It is what it is.
To knock out a guy that was out on his feet since like the third round, because this is what Deontay Wilder said. Because people asked, or at least his team was asking him, why did you look so tired early on, like the whole fight? And Wilder said, I wasn't tired. He said in the third round, Tyson Fury caught him with a punch to the ear that knocked off his equilibrium, and he said he was out of it. He was out on his feet the whole night, which explains why he was staggering all around the ring the whole night.
He was staggering around the ring because he doesn't have good feet, like I always explain. But it is what it is.
I just remember there were times, and I'm sure you guys probably remember this as well, Tyson would hit Deontay Wilder with a punch, and Deontay Wilder's legs would just cross. It was the type of stuff you see from fighters that are out on their feet. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with the video game Fight Night. You remember when you get hurt, you hear that whistling sound? Well, it looked like Tyson Fury, or it looked like Deontay Wilder was fighting with that whistling sound going on the whole night. So once again, I truly believe if it took Tyson Fury 11 rounds to get this version of Deontay Wilder out of there, when he really had nothing that he was throwing back other than a wild right hand, Tyson Fury is going to have a lot of problems with all of the other young heavyweights, including his mandatory Dillian White.
So that means that Dillian White is a greater fighter than any of the fighters that Tyson Fury has ever fought. Does that make any sense? And on top of that, when it comes down to it, apparently Dillian White, he's, so if you tell me this, if Tyson Fury, if he defeats Dillian White, you're going to give him the full amount of credit, right? And you're going to call him an all-time great fighter? Like, just stop, man. we all know Dante's game. It is what it is.
The thing with Dillian...
Once again, you always notice, people, they call Sergey Kovalev a quote-unquote bully fighter. Or at least they used to before he faced Andre Ward. But after he faced Andre Ward, what did they say? Oh, well, Andre Ward, all in all, he defeated a really skilled fighter in Sergey Kovalev. Really, that's interesting. How come he's not a bully fighter anymore? Vasily Lomachenko, he recently lost to Teofimo Lopez. Teofimo Lopez, overall, great fighter. And I thought that he beat Vasily Lomachenko. I would like to see a rematch, but that's Teofimo's, that's Teofimo's call. And he said he don't want to do a rematch, so it is what it is. That's up to him. But these guys have been tearing Teofimo Lopez down ever since. It is what it is. Now, if that would have been Devin Haney or Gervonta Tank Davis, because they like to call Vasily Lomachenko overrated and said overall that he was overstated and not as good as many people were claiming. But what would have happened if Gervonta Tank Davis or Guillermo Rigondeaux or, one of these other fighters that they like, what would have happened if Devin Haney would have beat him? They would have said, oh man, they beat the number one pound for pound fighter. What would happen if Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andre beat Canelo Alvarez? What would they say? They would say that they beat the number one pound for pound fighter, but I guarantee you, if Caleb Plant somehow pulls it out over Canelo Alvarez, what are they going to say? Oh, well, Caleb Plant, he beat a dude that was nothing but a Caucasian slayer anyway. That's all they're going to say. So it is what it is.
White guys, is Tyson Fury, since he's been in the heavyweight division, he's never fought a complete fighter. I have to keep repeating.
Bullshit when it comes down to it, but it is what it is. Like I said, Vladimir Klitschko, he was one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. And Deontay Wilder, like I said, was he a complete technical fighter? No, he was not, but he was a very, very big threat. It is what it is.
In this point, because there's always new subscribers and some people don't.
And Dante, in your opinion, if you think all in all that Tyson Fury is not that great because he has never completed or never beat that complete of fighters, you should say the same thing about Deontay Wilder, because who the hell has Deontay Wilder ever beat? So in your opinion, Anthony Joshua has always been greater than Deontay Wilder because he has wins over Dillian White and Andrew Ruiz and, all these other guys, Joseph Parker, who are allegedly more complete than Deontay. So how come you were always trying to argue that Deontay was above Anthony Joshua? These guys, man, these guys are so full of shit. This dude Dante, man.
Catch the previous videos, so I'm going to say it again. Hands down, Tyson Fury has the best resume right now in the heavyweight division. But with that being said, let's look at the 2 best fighters he beat. He beat Vladimir Klitschko and he beat Deontay Wilder. Vladimir Klitschko was a jabbing, grabbing fighter. That was his strategy. That's what he did. He would jab you and grab you, and try to set you up with a hard right hand, right? And then when it comes to Deontay Wilder, he just tries to land nothing but the right hand. He doesn't even have a jab, right? So neither one of...
Oh, he doesn't have a jab. I thought Deontay Wilder had this Larry Holmes-like jab. I thought that he overall had this great jab coming into the fight. What happened to that jab all of a sudden, man? Anyway.
These fighters were complete fighters. They were both good heavyweights. They were both dangerous, but they were not complete fighters. Fighters like Dillian White, fighters like Jared Anderson, fighters like Frank Sanchez, who just beat a Jabba, right? Even Joe Joyce. These are complete fighters. Why? Because they have all of the...
Joe Joyce? Really, man? Joe Joyce, did you see him in his last fight against Carlos Takam? Bro, come on, man.
Tools, and they use them. They are going to throw everything in the book, right? These are those type of fighters that Tim Witherspoon was talking about when he says he didn't see any art. He didn't see the art of boxing. You see that in fighters like Dillian White and all those other fighters that I just mentioned. You know, it's really revealing to hear a champion, a former heavyweight champion, say what he said about Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder's performance, because this was one of the biggest heavyweight fights, right? Especially of recent time.
Right, but before Deontay Wilder got his ass kicked, every time Lennox Lewis or Andre Ward or a former fighter Mike Tyson would say something about Deontay Wilder, they were always hating. They were always Uncle Toms. They were always this. That's interesting.
And we all know that we never heard anyone criticizing a lack of skill being displayed when it came to fights like Lewis versus Vitaly Klitschko, Mike Tyson versus anybody, right? Holyfield versus anybody. We never heard this kind of stuff.
Actually, that's not true. Because Holyfield, he did not always look the most skilled in the ring. Go ahead and look at Holyfield in some of the earlier fights in his career. He fought this one dude, forgot the man's name, Bert somebody. And Evander Holyfield nearly got his ass canned. I can't remember the dude's name. He was a top contender. He suffered a lot of losses back in the day, but the man had power like... he had power overall like a horse. Man was very, very, very strong, but I can't remember his name. When it came down to it, Evander Holyfield, he did not always look the most skilled in his fights either. And that's why he lost some of the bigger fights in his career as well. He got completely outboxed by Lennox Lewis. He lost a trilogy to Riddick Bowe. So if you're trying to say that Evander Holyfield is greater than Tyson Fury, he was a great fighter. But no, he's not greater than Tyson Fury. Sorry, I can't say that.
The Klitschkos, we never heard anyone say, where was the skill? Where was the art of boxing?
Why do you keep bringing up the Klitschkos, but then at the same time you say that Klitschko was a completely unskilled fighter? Do you even know what the hell you're talking about? This guy, man.
We only heard this when it came to Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder. I am telling you guys right now, Dillian White is going to give Tyson Fury a lot of problems.
We'll see about that. I like Dillian White, but I just don't think he has enough to beat Tyson. We'll see. I would like to see Dillian White in a rematch against Anthony Joshua. And I think Anthony Joshua would can his ass, but we'll see.
Know for sure who's going to win that fight because I do believe it's a 50-50 fight. But I truly believe Dillian White has a very, very good chance of beating Tyson Fury, especially the version we just seen against Deontay Wilder. And the main reason I'm talking about Dillian White is because he is Tyson Fury's mandatory. Tyson has already been ordered to fight him next. He can't skip over him and go fight Usyk because Usyk...
Well, he might, because I do believe that, all in all, that they may allow a unification. Now, Dillian White wasn't just Tyson Fury's mandatory. He was also Deontay Wilder's mandatory for a very, very, very long time. But every time Dillian White was brought up against Deontay Wilder, these guys act like Dillian White was just some hooker on the street. They just acted like, all in all, that this dude wasn't worth shit when it came down to it. All of a sudden, he needs to face Tyson Fury, and you can already tell they're using the narrative that Tyson Fury is going to avoid Dillian White and all sort of bullshit when it comes down to it. Even though the Usyk or Anthony Joshua fight is a greater fight, for a complete unification match. But these guys are going to try to twist it because I can already see what Dante is trying to allege. He's going to try to twist it, and he's going to try to say that Tyson Fury is avoiding Dillian White. So watch out for certain narratives like that. Watch out for certain narratives by Blue Blood Sports TV and Dante's Boxing Nation and Aki TV and Boxing Eagle. All those slime balls.
Already has to fight against Anthony Joshua. As long as Anthony Joshua doesn't step aside, Tyson is going to have to fight Dillian White. Now, I've been talking about the White fight ever since, Tyson Fury beat Deontay Wilder. And it's just so funny because every time I bring his name up, Dillian White is garbage, etc., etc.
That's the same shit you were saying every time Dillian White was brought up, Dante. Don't fucking play that bullshit when it comes down. And don't act like overall that, you're completely innocent. This dude is such a goddamn slime ball.
Deserve to fight Tyson Fury. Tyson shouldn't fight him, etc. They're saying all of these things, right? But the funny thing is...
Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that Dillian White is a bad fight. But I would much prefer to see Tyson Fury up against Alexander Usyk or Anthony Joshua. I like Dillian White, but is he going to be remembered as much of a great fighter as an Anthony Joshua or Alexander Usyk or Deontay Wilder? We'll have to see.
These are the same fans that were saying Deontay Wilder needs to fight Dillian White when Dillian wasn't even his man.
Right, but no, Dillian was his mandatory, Dante. You're lying about that, but it is what it is. But what Deontay Wilder told him is that you should fight Luis Ortiz. And you went on that narrative. So you know what you should tell Dillian White right now, Dante? That he should fight Luis Ortiz if he wants the Tyson Fury fight, or that he has to get past Otto Wallin first. Some bullshit like that. It's so funny how Dante, now that, the things are switched, and Tyson Fury, he's a fighter that he literally loathes when it comes down to it. All of a sudden, he's pushing for Dillian White to fight Tyson Fury. Ain't that a bitch? And I would not necessarily mind the Dillian White fight, but Tyson Fury, he said repeatedly that he don't want to, he overall does not want to fight much longer. So if he faces Alexander Usyk or Anthony Joshua or the winner of that rematch, I really don't have a problem with that, because in my opinion, both of those fighters are better and greater than Dillian White anyway.
They were saying he needs to fight Dillian White. He's ducking Dillian White because this was the time when Deontay Wilder, he was going after Anthony Joshua. Meanwhile,
allegedly going after Anthony Joshua. When the hell was Deontay Wilder ever going after Anthony Joshua? These guys always spread this bullshit about how he went after Anthony Joshua, but he turned down that DAZN deal. And every time it was talked about being in Britain, Deontay Wilder didn't seem too good about that idea. You were chasing after Anthony Joshua. When exactly was that? I really don't remember that.
all these fans, they continue to say, oh yeah, you're ducking Dillian White, you're scared of him. Now all of a sudden they're saying that Dillian White is a bum and doesn't deserve to fight Tyson Fury.
So they switched just like you switched, Dante, huh? I don't necessarily mind the Dillian White fight happening. But like I said, Tyson Fury, he said that he may only fight one or two more times in his career. And if he is, I would rather much see an Alexander Usyk or Anthony Joshua fight than a Dillian White fight. There's no offense against Dillian White, but he's not on that same level as an Alexander Usyk or Anthony Joshua.
He has no chance in all these other things. We know what time it is, right? Listen, Bob Arum has already made it clear that he wants to make this fight next. He said this fight would be huge in the UK, which it obviously would be. So there's really no reason for the fight not to happen. But I would not be surprised if Tyson Fury, he tries to find a way out. Remember, guys.
You see that? I already told you guys, I can read these guys like I can read the back of my hand. Dante, he's going to allege overall that Tyson Fury is avoiding Dillian White. That's what he's going to allege.
Tyson knows Dillian White very well. Dillian White, he knocked down Tyson Fury multiple times in sparring. So I'm just thinking
once again, I would need proof of that.
To myself, Tyson's got to be saying to himself, man, if Dillian was able to do that to me with bigger gloves and headgear, imagine how dangerous this man is going to be with regular 10-ounce gloves, right? And no headgear. Not to mention, Dillian White is going to be almost the same weight as Tyson Fury. So Tyson won't be able to win a wrestling match. Or it's going to be a lot more harder.
I bet he can win a wrestling match against almost any of these fighters. Fury has an elite jab overall when it comes down to it. It's not really a wrestling match. It's just trying to tie them up. You know, I didn't hear you call it a wrestling match when Andre Ward or Floyd Mayweather Jr. would tie up certain fighters. You know, it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, man, Dante is just something else. You know, this dude was standing by Deontay Wilder for so long. At least when it comes to some of the other people or some of the other channels, you know, they at least stuck by Deontay Wilder. And I'm not a person that promotes the fanboy mentality. But at least some of these other dudes that rode on that hill for so long, like Blue Blood Sports TV or Fan and International Boxing or some of these other guys, at least they continued to say that Deontay Wilder was a great fighter. Dante literally threw Deontay Wilder to the side of the curb like he was some 14-year-old hooker when it comes down to it overall. And then all in all, he basically said, oh, well, Tyson Fury, when it comes down to it, he's never faced a complete fighter. This dude is such a slime ball.
So even though Tyson Fury gets a lot of credit for being the first man to knock out the undefeated heavyweight champion in Deontay Wilder, I think it will be far more impressive for him to go in there and completely dominate or knock out Dillian White. because once again, Dillian White is a complete fighter. He has a skill set Tyson Fury's previous opponents had. So let's see if the fight gets made. Let's see if Tyson Fury takes the fight or just tries to find a way to vacate. But it would make no sense for him to vacate because then he won't be able to fight Usyk for the undisputed or fight Anthony Joshua for the undisputed title. So let's see how it all plays out. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
Anyways, that's really about it for this video. I just thought that I would review that, but I thought overall that was just hilarious. But anyways, when it comes down to the overall, like I said, you're going to see certain people overall when it comes to Tyson Fury, depending on how much longer he fights. Even if he were to retire today, you're going to see certain people claim that Tyson Fury is the greatest heavyweight of all time. And you're going to get certain people like Dante that try to claim overall that he's not even that great of a fighter. So you're going to have to look out for that. Like I said, this is what I would call Patrick Mahomes syndrome. That, especially if you are a demographic that usually is not so dominant in this sport, but all of a sudden you're coming out of nowhere. There's a lot of people overall that have that racial pride and overall have a racial investment. It's the same thing with Patrick Mahomes. If Patrick Mahomes, if he wins, let's say 4 Super Bowls, there's going to be a lot of people all in all that try to debate him as the greatest quarterback of all time. Now, do I believe that he's going to win 4 Super Bowls? We'll see. I think that he's a great quarterback, but if I had to guess, maybe at most about 2 or 3. We'll see what happens. But when it comes down to the overall bottom line is this. Because Patrick Mahomes is a mixed quarterback, mainly counted as a black quarterback, you're going to get a certain amount of the Caucasian analysts overall that want to protect that Caucasian pride when it comes down to just because their fighters, or excuse me, not their fighters, their quarterbacks in the past usually have been counted over the black quarterbacks. Because, of course, they have accomplished more usually, but when it comes down to it, it's the same thing here. If Tyson Fury, if he ends up undefeated, and if he defeats Alexander Usyk and Anthony Joshua, excuse me, he will pretty much have defeated every all-time great fighter of this generation, at least that he could in his division. And especially if he ends up undefeated, Dante and a certain amount of these other guys know that Tyson Fury is going to have a debate in that all-time great category in terms of the greatest heavyweight. And they don't want that. So it is what it is. But it's whatever. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. We'll see what happens with this. And I'll talk to you all later.